Ivanhoe, by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 5. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? Merchant of Venice. Oswald, returning, whispered into the ear of his master, "It is a Jew who calls himself Isaac of York. Is it fit I should marshal him into the hall?" "Let Gurth do thine office, Oswald," said Wamba with his usual effrontery. "The swineherd will be a fit usher to the Jew." "Saint Mary," said the abbot, crossing himself, "an unbelieving Jew, and admitted into this presence?" "A dog Jew," echoed the Templar, "to approach a defender of the Holy Sepulchre?" "By my faith," said Wamba, "it would seem the Templars love the Jews' inheritance better than they do their company." "Peace, my worthy guests," said Cedric. "My hospitality must not be bounded by your dislikes. If heaven bore with the whole nation of stiff-necked unbelievers for more years than a layman can number, we may endure the presence of one Jew for a few hours. But I constrain no man to converse or to feed with him. Let him have a board and a morsel apart, unless," he said, smiling, "these turbaned strangers will admit his society." "Sir Franklin," answered the Templar, "my Saracen slaves are true Moslems, and scorn as much as any Christian to hold intercourse with a Jew." "Now, in faith," said Wamba, "I cannot see that the worshippers of Mahound and Termagant have so greatly the advantage over the people once chosen of heaven." "He shall sit with thee, Wamba," said Cedric. "The fool and the knave will be well met." "The fool," answered Wamba, raising the relics of a gammon of bacon, "will take care to erect a bulwark against the knave." "Hush," said Cedric, "for here he comes." Introduced with little ceremony, and advancing with fear and hesitation, and many a bow of deep humility, a tall, thin, old man, who, however, had lost by the habit of stooping much of his actual height, approached the lower end of the board. His features, keen and regular, with an aquiline nose and grey hair and beard, would have been considered as handsome, had they not been the marks of a physiognomy peculiar to a race, which, during those dark ages, was alike detested by the credulous and prejudiced vulgar, and persecuted by the greedy and rapacious nobility, and who, perhaps owing to that very hatred and persecution, had adopted a national character in which there was much, to say the least, mean and unamiable. The Jew's dress, which appeared to have suffered considerably from the storm, was a plain russet cloak, of many folds, covering a dark purple tunic. He had large boots lined with fur, and a belt around his waist, which sustained a small knife, together with a case for writing materials, but no weapon. He wore a high square yellow cap of a peculiar fashion, assigned to his nation to distinguish them from Christians, and which he doffed with great humility at the door of the hall. The reception of this person in the hall of Cedric the Saxon was such as might have satisfied the most prejudiced enemy of the tribes of Israel. Cedric himself coldly nodded in answer to the Jew's repeated salutations, and signed him to take the place at the lower end of the table, where, however, no one offered to make room for him. On the contrary, as he passed along the file, casting a timid, supplicating glance, and turning towards each of those who occupied the lower end of the board, the Saxon domestics squared their shoulders, and continued to devour their supper with great perseverance, paying not the least attention to the wants of the new guest. The attendants of the abbot crossed themselves with looks of pious horror, and the very heathen Saracens, as Isaac drew near them, curled up their whiskers with indignation, and laid their hands on their poniards, as if ready to rid themselves by the most desperate means of the apprehended contamination of his nearer approach. Probably the same motives which induced Cedric to open his hall to this son of a rejected people would have made him insist on his attendants receiving Isaac with more courtesy. But the abbot had at this moment engaged him in a most interesting discussion on the breed and character of his favourite hounds, which he would not have interrupted for matters of much greater importance than that of a Jew going to bed supperless. While Isaac thus stood an outcast in the present society, like his people among the nations, looking in vain for welcome or resting place, the pilgrim who sat by the chimney took compassion upon him, and resigned his seat, saying briefly, "Old man, my garments are dried, my hunger is appeased, thou art both wet and fasting." So saying, he gathered together and brought to a flame the decaying brands which lay scattered on the ample hearth, took from the larger board a mess of pottage and seethed kid, and placed it upon the small table at which he had himself supped, and, without waiting the Jew's thanks, went to the other side of the hall, whether from unwillingness to hold more close communication with the object of his benevolence, or from a wish to draw near to the upper end of the table, seemed uncertain. Had there been painters in those days capable to execute such a subject, the Jew, as he bent his withered form and expanded his chilled and trembling hands over the fire, would have formed no bad emblematical personification of the winter season. Having dispelled the cold, he turned eagerly to the smoking mess which was placed before him, and ate with a haste and an apparent relish that seemed to betoken long abstinence from food. Meanwhile, the abbot and Cedric continued their discourse upon hunting. The Lady Rowena seemed engaged in conversation with one of her attendant females, and the haughty Templar, whose eye seemed to wander from the Jew to the Saxon beauty, resolved in his mind thoughts which appeared deeply to interest him. "I marvel, worthy Cedric," said the abbot, as their discourse proceeded, "that great as your predilection is for your own manly language, you do not receive the Norman French into your favour, so far at least as the mystery of woodcraft and hunting is concerned. Surely no tongue is so rich in the various phrases which the field sports demand, or furnishes means to the experienced woodman so well to express his jovial art." "Good faithful Aymer," said the Saxon, "be it known to you, I care not for those oversea refinements, without which I can well enough take my pleasure in the woods. I can wind my horn, though I call not the blast either a retreat or a mort. I can cheer my dogs on the prey, and I can flay and quarter the animal when it is brought down, without using the new-fangled jargon of curé, arbor, nombre, and all the babble of the fabulous Sir Tristram." "The French," said the Templar, raising his voice with the presumptuousness and authoritative tone which he used upon all occasions, "is not only the natural language of the chase, but that of love and of war, in which ladies should be won and enemies defied." "Pledge me in a cup of wine, Sir Templar," said Cedric, "and fill another to the abbot, while I look back some 30 years to tell you another tale." As Cedric the Saxon then was, his plain English tale needed no garnish from French troubadours when it was told in the ear of beauty, and the field of Northallerton upon the day of the Holy Standard could tell whether the Saxon war-cry was not heard as far within the ranks of the Scottish hosts as the cri de guerre of the boldest Norman baron. To the memory of the brave who fought there, pledge me, my guests." He drank deep, and went on with increasing warmth. "Ay, that was a day of cleaving of shields, when 100 banners were bent forward over the heads of the valiant, and blood flowed round like water, and death was held better than flight. A Saxon bard had called it a feast of the swords, a gathering of the eagles to the prey, the clashing of bills upon shield and helmet, the shouting of battle more joyful than the clamour of a bridal. But our bards are no more," he said. "Our deeds are lost in those of another race. Our language, our very name, is hastening to decay, and none mourns for it save one solitary old man. Cupbearer, nay, fill the goblets. To the strong in arms, Sir Templar, be their race or language what it will, who now bear them best in Palestine among the champions of the cross." "It becomes not one wearing this badge to answer," said Sir Brian de Bois Guilbert. "Yet to whom, besides the sworn champions of the Holy Sepulchre, can the palm be assigned among the champions of the cross?" "To the Knights Hospitallers," said the Abbot. "I have a brother of their order." "I impeach not their fame," said the Templar. "Nevertheless—" "I think, friend Cedric," said Wamba, interfering, "that had Richard of the Lion's Heart been wise enough to have taken a fool's advice, he might have stayed at home with his merry Englishmen, and left the recovery of Jerusalem to those same knights who had most to do with the loss of it." "Were there, then, none in the English army," said the Lady Rowena, "whose names are worthy to be mentioned with the Knights of the Temple and of St. John?" "Forgive me, lady," replied de Bois Guilbert. "The English monarch did indeed bring to Palestine a host of gallant warriors, second only to those whose breasts have been the unceasing bulwark of that blessed land." "Second to none," said the Pilgrim, who had stood near enough to hear, and had listened to this conversation with marked impatience. All turned toward this spot from whence this unexpected asseveration was heard. "I say," repeated the Pilgrim in a firm and strong voice, "that the English chivalry were second to none who ever drew sword in defence of the Holy Land. I say besides, for I saw it, that King Richard himself and 5 of his knights held a tournament after the taking of St. John d'Acre, as challengers against all comers. I say that, on that day, each knight ran 3 courses, and cast to the ground 3 antagonists. I add, that 7 of these assailants were knights of the Temple, and Sir Brian de Bois Guilbert well knows the truth of what I tell you. It is impossible for language to describe the bitter scowl of rage which rendered yet darker the swarthy countenance of the Templar. In the extremity of his resentment and confusion, his quivering fingers gripped toward the handle of his sword, and perhaps only withdrew from the consciousness that no act of violence could be safely executed in that place and presence. Cedric, whose feelings were all of a right onward and simple kind, and were seldom occupied by more than one subject at once, omitted, in the joyous glee with which he heard of the glory of his countrymen, to remark the angry confusion of his guest. "I would give thee this golden bracelet, Pilgrim," he said. "Couldst thou tell me the names of those knights who upheld so gallantly the renown of merry England?" "That I will do blithely," replied the Pilgrim, "and without guerdon. My oath for a time prohibits me from touching gold." "I will wear the bracelet for you, if you will, friend Palmer," said Wamba. "The first in honour as in arms, in renown as in place," said the Pilgrim, "was the brave Richard, King of England." "I forgive him," said Cedric. "I forgive him his descent from the tyrant Duke William." "The Earl of Leicester was the second," continued the Pilgrim. "Sir Thomas Multon of Gilsland was the third." "Of Saxon descent, he at least," said Cedric with exultation. "Sir Fulk Dwally the fourth," proceeded the Pilgrim. "Saxon also, at least by the mother's side," continued Cedric, who listened with the utmost eagerness, and forgot, in part at least, his hatred to the Normans in the common triumph of the King of England and his islanders. "And who was the fifth?" he demanded. "The fifth was Sir Edwin Turnham." genuine Saxon, by the soul of Hengist!" shouted Cedric. "And the sixth?" he continued with eagerness. "How name you the sixth?" "The sixth," answered the Palmer, after a pause, in which he seemed to recollect himself, "was a young knight of lesser renown and lower rank, assumed into that honourable company less to aid their enterprise than to make up their number. His name dwells not in my memory." "Sir Palmer," said Sir Brian de Bois Guilbert, scornfully, "this assumed forgetfulness, after so much has been remembered, comes too late to serve your purpose. I will myself tell the name of the knight before whose lance fortune and my horse's fault occasioned my falling. It was the Knight of Ivanhoe, nor was there one of the six that, for his years, had more renown in arms. Yet this I will say, and loudly, that were he in England and durst repeat, in this week's tournament, the challenge of Saint Jean d'Acre, I, mounted and armed as I now am, would give him every advantage of weapons, and abide the result." "Your challenge would soon be answered," replied the Palmer, "were your antagonists near you. As the matter is, disturb not the peaceful hall with vaunts of the issue of a conflict which you well know cannot take place. If Ivanhoe ever returns from Palestine, I will be his surety that he meets you." "A goodly security," said the Knight Templar, "and what do you prefer as pledge?" "This reliquary," said the Palmer, taking a small ivory box from his bosom, and crossing himself, "containing a portion of the true cross, brought from the monastery of Mount Carmel." The Prior of Jorvaulx crossed himself and repeated a paternoster, in which all devoutly joined, excepting the Jew, the Mahomedans, and the Templar, the latter of whom, without veiling his bonnet, or testifying any reverence for the alleged sanctity of the relic, took from his neck a gold chain, which he flung on the board, saying, "Let Prior Aymer hold my pledge and that of this nameless vagrant, in token that, when the Knight of Ivanhoe comes within the 4 seas of Britain, he underlies the challenge of Brian de Bois Guilbert, which, if he answer not, I will proclaim him as a coward on the walls of every temple court in Europe." "It will not need," said the Lady Rowena, breaking silence. "My voice shall be heard, if no other in this hall is raised, in behalf of the absent Ivanhoe. I affirm he will meet fairly every honourable challenge. Could my weak warrant add security to the inestimable pledge of this holy pilgrim, I would pledge name and fame that Ivanhoe gives this proud knight the meeting he desires." A crowd of conflicting emotions seemed to have occupied Cedric, and kept him silent during this discussion. Gratified pride, resentment, embarrassment, chased each other over his broad and open brow, like the shadow of clouds drifting over a harvest field, while his attendants, on whom the name of the sixth knight seemed to produce an effect almost electrical, hung in suspense upon their master's looks. But when Rowena spoke, the sound of her voice seemed to startle him from his silence. "Lady," said Cedric, "this beseems not. Were further pledge necessary, I myself, offended, and justly offended, as I am, would yet gage my honour for the honour of Ivanhoe. But the wager of battle is complete, even according to the fantastic fashions of Norman chivalry. Is it not, Father Aymer?" "It is," replied the Prior, "and the blessed relic and rich chain will I bestow safely in the treasury of our convent, until the decision of this warlike challenge." Having thus spoken, he crossed himself again and again, and after many genuflections and muttered prayers, he delivered the reliquary to Brother Ambrose, his attendant monk, while he himself swept up with less ceremony, but perhaps with no less internal satisfaction, the golden chain, and bestowed it in a pouch lined with perfumed leather, which opened under his arm. "And now, Sir Cedric," he said, "my ears are chiming vespers with the strength of your good wine. Permit us another pledge to the welfare of the Lady Rowena, and indulge us with liberty to pass to our repose." "By the road of the Bromholm," said the Saxon, "you do but small credit to your fame, Sir Prior. Report speaks you a bonny monk, that would hear the matin chime ere he quitted his bowl; and old as I am, I feared to have shame in encountering you. But by my faith, a Saxon boy of 12 in my time would not so soon have relinquished his goblet." The Prior had his own reasons, however, for persevering in the course of temperance which he had adopted. He was not only a professional peacemaker, but from practice a hater of all feuds and brawls. It was not altogether from a love to his neighbour or to himself, or from a mixture of both. On the present occasion he had an instinctive apprehension of the fiery temper of the Saxon, and saw the danger that the reckless and presumptuous spirit, of which his companion had already given so many proofs, might at length produce some disagreeable explosion. He therefore gently insinuated the incapacity of the native of any other country to engage in the genial conflict of the bowl with the hardy and strong-headed Saxons. Something he mentioned but slightly about his own holy character, and ended by pressing his proposal to depart to repose. The grace cup was accordingly served round, and the guests, after making deep obeisance to their landlord and to the Lady Rowena, arose and mingled in the hall, while the heads of the family, separated by doors, retired with their attendants. "Unbelieving dog," said the Templar to Isaac the Jew, as he passed him in the throng, "dost thou bend thy course to the tournament?" "I do so propose," replied Isaac, bowing in all humility, "if it please your reverend valour." "Ay," said the knight, "to gnaw the bowels of our nobles with usury, and to gull women and boys with gauds and toys, I warrant thee store of shekels in thy Jewish scrip." "Not a shekel, not a silver penny, not a halfling, so help me the God of Abraham," said the Jew, clasping his hands. "I go but to seek the assistance of some brethren of my tribe, to aid me to pay the fine which the exchequer of the Jews has imposed upon me. Father Jacob be my speed. I am an impoverished wretch. The very gaberdine I wear is borrowed from Reuben of Tadcaster." The Templar smiled sourly, as he replied, "Beshrew thee for a false-hearted liar!" And passing onward, as if disdaining farther conference, he communed with his Moslem slaves in a language unknown to the bystanders. The poor Israelite seemed so staggered by the address of the military monk, that the Templar had passed on to the extremity of the hall ere he raised his head from the humble posture which he had assumed, so far as to be sensible of his departure. And when he did look around, it was with the astonished air of one at whose feet a thunderbolt has just burst, and who hears still the astounding report ringing in his ears. The Templar and Prior were shortly after marshalled to their sleeping apartments by the steward and the cupbearer, each attended by 2 torch-bearers and 2 servants carrying refreshments, while servants of inferior condition indicated to their retinue and to the other guests their respective places of repose. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. To buy his favour I extend this friendship. If he will take it, so. If not, adieu. And for my love, I pray you wrong me not. Merchant of Venice. As the palmer, lighted by a domestic with a torch, passed through the intricate combination of apartments of this large and irregular mansion, the cupbearer, coming behind him, whispered in his ear that if he had no objection to a cup of good mead in his apartment, there were many domestics in that family who would gladly hear the news he had brought from the Holy Land, and particularly that which concerned the Knight of Ivanhoe. Wamba presently appeared to urge the same request, observing that a cup after midnight was worth 3 after curfew. Without disputing a maxim urged by such grave authority, the palmer thanked them for their courtesy, but observed that he had included in his religious vow an obligation never to speak in the kitchen on matters which were prohibited in the hall. "That vow," said Wamba to the cupbearer, "would scarce suit a serving man." The cupbearer shrugged up his shoulders in displeasure. "I thought to have lodged him in the solaire chamber," said he; "but since he is so unsocial to Christians, e'en let him take the next stall to Isaac the Jews. And Wold," said he to the torch-bearer, "carry the pilgrim to the southern cell. I give you good night," he added. "Sir Palmer, with small thanks for short courtesy." "Good night, and Our Lady's benison," said the Palmer with composure, and his guide moved forward. In a small antechamber, into which several doors opened, and which was lighted by a small iron lamp, they met a second interruption from the waiting-maid of Rowena, who, saying in a tone of authority that her mistress desired to speak with the Palmer, took the torch from the hand of Anwold, and, bidding him await her return, made a sign to the Palmer to follow. Apparently he did not think it proper to decline this invitation, as he had done the former, for though his gesture indicated some surprise at the summons, he obeyed it without answer or remonstrance. A short passage and an ascent of 7 steps, each of which was composed of a solid beam of oak, led him to the apartment of the Lady Rowena, the rude magnificence of which corresponded to the respect which was paid to her by the lord of the mansion. The walls were covered with embroidered hangings, on which different coloured silks, interwoven with gold and silver threads, had been employed, with all the art of which the age was capable, to represent the sports of hunting and hawking. The bed was adorned with the same rich tapestry, and surrounded with curtains dyed with purple. The seats had also their stained coverings, and one, which was higher than the rest, was accommodated with a footstool of ivory, curiously carved. No fewer than 4 silver candelabras, holding great waxen torches, served to illuminate this apartment. Yet let not modern beauty envy the magnificence of a Saxon princess. The walls of the apartment were so ill finished, and so full of crevices, that the rich hangings shook to the night blast, and in despite of a sort of screen intended to protect them from the wind, the flame of the torches streamed sideways into the air, like the unfurled pennon of a chieftain. Magnificence there was, with some rude attempt at taste, but of comfort there was little, and being unknown, it was unmissed. The Lady Rowena, with 3 of her attendants standing at her back, and arranging her hair ere she lay down to rest, was seated in the sort of throne already mentioned, and looked as if born to exact general homage. The pilgrim acknowledged her claim to it by a low genuflection. "Rise, Palmer," she said graciously. "The defender of the absent has a right to favourable reception from all who value truth and honour manhood." She then said to her train, "Retire, excepting only Elgitha. I would speak with this holy pilgrim." The maidens, without leaving the apartment, retired to its further extremity, and sat down on a small bench against the wall, where they remained mute as statues, though at such a distance that their whispers could not have interrupted the conversation of their mistress. "Pilgrim," said the lady, after a moment's pause, during which she seemed uncertain how to address him, "you this night mentioned a name. I mean," she said with a degree of effort, "the name of Ivanhoe, in the walls where by nature and kindred it should have sounded most acceptably. And yet such is the perverse course of fate, that of many whose hearts must have throbbed at the sound, I only dare ask you where, and in what condition, you left him of whom you spoke. We heard that, having remained in Palestine, on account of his impaired health, after the departure of the English army, he had experienced the persecution of the French faction, to whom the Templars are known to be attached." "I know little of the Knight of Ivanhoe," answered the Palmer with a troubled voice. "I would I knew him better, since you, lady, are interested in his fate. He hath, I believe, surmounted the persecution of his enemies in Palestine, and is on the eve of returning to England, where you, lady, must know better than I what is his chance of happiness." The Lady Rowena sighed deeply, and asked more particularly when the Knight of Ivanhoe might be expected in his native country, and whether he would not be exposed to great dangers by the road. On the first point, the Palmer professed ignorance. On the second, he said that the voyage might be safely made by the way of Venice and Genoa, and from thence through France to England. Ivanhoe, he said, was so well acquainted with the language and manners of the French, that there was no fear of his incurring any hazard during that part of his travels. "Would to God," said the Lady Rowena, "he were here safely arrived, and able to bear arms in the approaching tourney, in which the chivalry of this land are expected to display their address and valour. Should Athelstane of Coningsburgh obtain the prize, Ivanhoe is like to hear evil tidings when he reaches England. How looked he, stranger, when you last saw him? Had disease laid her hand heavy upon his strength and comeliness?" "He was darker," said the Palmer, "and thinner than when he came from Cyprus in the train of Coeur de Lion, and care seemed to sit heavily on his brow. But I approached not his presence, because he is unknown to me." "He will," said the lady, "I fear, find little in his native land to clear those clouds from his countenance. Thanks, good pilgrim, for your information concerning the companion of my childhood. Maidens," she said, "draw near, offer the sleeping cup to this holy man, whom I will no longer detain from repose." One of the maidens presented a silver cup containing a rich mixture of wine and spice, which Rowena barely put to her lips. It was then offered to the Palmer, who, after a low obeisance, tasted a few drops. "Accept this alms, friend," continued the lady, offering a piece of gold, "in acknowledgment of thy painful travail, and of the shrines thou hast visited." The Palmer received the boon with another low reverence, and followed Elgitha out of the apartment. In the anteroom he found his attendant Anwold, who, taking the torch from the hand of the waiting-maid, conducted him with more haste than ceremony to an exterior and ignoble part of the building, where a number of small apartments, or rather cells, served for sleeping places in the lower order of domestics, and to strangers of mean degree. "In which of these sleeps the Jew?" said the pilgrim. "The unbelieving dog," answered Anwold, "kennels in the cell next your holiness. Saint Dunstan, how it must be scraped and cleansed ere it be again fit for a Christian!" "And where sleeps Gurt the swineherd?" said the stranger. "Gurt," replied the bondsman, "sleeps in the cell on your right, as the Jew in that to your left. You serve to keep the child of circumcision separate from the abomination of his tribe. You might have occupied a more honourable place, had you accepted Oswald's invitation." "It is as well as it is," said the Palmer. "The company even of a Jew can hardly spread contamination through an oaken partition." So saying, he entered the cabin allotted to him, and taking the torch from the domestic's hand, thanked him, and wished him good night. Having shut the door of his cell, he placed the torch in a candlestick made of wood, and looked around his sleeping apartment, the furniture of which was the most simple kind. It consisted of a rude wooden stool, and still ruder hutch or bed frame, stuffed with clean straw, and accommodated with 2 or 3 sheepskins by way of bedclothes. The Palmer, having extinguished his torch, threw himself, without taking off any part of his clothes, on this rude couch, and slept, or at least retained his recumbent posture, till the earliest sunbeams found their way through the little grated window, which served at once to admit both air and light to his uncomfortable cell. He then started up, and after repeating his matins and adjusting his dress as he left it, and entered that of Isaac the Jew, lifting the latch as gently as he could. The inmate was lying in troubled slumber upon a couch similar to that upon which the palmer himself had passed the night. Such parts of his dress as the Jew had laid aside on the preceding evening were disposed carefully around his person, as if to prevent the hazard of their being carried off during his slumbers. There was a trouble on his brow amounting almost to agony. His hands and arms moved convulsively, as if struggling with the nightmare. And besides several ejaculations in Hebrew, the following were distinctly heard in the Norman English, or mixed language of the country. "For the sake of the God of Abraham, spare an unhappy old man. I am poor, I am penniless. Should your irons wrench my limbs asunder, I could not gratify you." The palmer awaited not the end of the Jew's vision, but stirred him with his pilgrim's staff. The touch probably associated, as is usual, with some of the apprehensions excited by his dream, for the old man started up, his grey hair standing almost erect upon his head, and huddling some part of his garment about him, while he held the detached pieces with the tenacious grasp of a falcon. He fixed upon the palmer his keen black eyes, expressive of wild surprise and of bodily apprehension. "Fear nothing from me, Isaac," said the palmer. "I come as your friend." "The God of Israel requite you," said the Jew, greatly relieved. "I dreamed—but Father Abraham be praised, it was but a dream." Then, collecting himself, he added in his usual tone, "And what may it be your pleasure to want at so early an hour with the poor Jew?" "It is to tell you," said the palmer, "that if you leave not this mansion instantly, and travel not with some haste, your journey may prove a dangerous one." "Holy father," said the Jew, "whom could it interest to endanger so poor a wretch as I am?" "The purpose you can best guess," said the pilgrim; "but rely on this, that when the Templar crossed the hall yesternight, he spoke to his Mussulman slaves in the Saracen language, which I well understand, and charged them this morning to watch the journey of the Jew, to seize upon him when at a convenient distance from the mansion, and to conduct him to the castle of Philippa de Malvoisin, or to that Reginald Front de Bœuf." It is impossible to describe the extremity of terror which seized upon the Jew at this information, and seemed at once to overpower his whole faculties. His arms fell down to his sides, and his head drooped on his breast. His knees bent under his weight. Every nerve and muscle of his frame seemed to collapse and lose its energy, and he sunk at the foot of the palmer, not in the fashion of one who intentionally stoops, kneels, or prostrates himself to excite compassion, but like a man borne down on all sides by the pressure of some invisible force, which crushes him to the earth without the power of resistance. "Holy God of Abraham!" was his first exclamation, folding and elevating his wrinkled hands, but without raising his grey head from the pavement. "O holy Moses! O blessed Aaron! The dream is not dreamed for naught, and the vision cometh not in vain. I feel their irons already tear my sinews. I feel the rack pass over my body like the saws, and harrows, and axes of iron over the men of Rabbah, and of the cities of the children of Ammon." "Stand up, Isaac, and hearken to me," said the palmer, who viewed the extremity of his distress with a compassion in which contempt was largely mingled. "You have cause for your terror, considering how your brethren have been used in order to extort from them their hoards, both by princes and nobles. But stand up, I say, and I will point out to you the means of escape. Leave this mansion instantly, while its inmates sleep sound after the night's revel. I will guide you by the secret paths of the forest, known as well to me as to any forester that ranges it, and I will not leave you till you are under safe conduct of some chief or baron going to the tournament, whose goodwill you have probably the means of securing." As the ears of Isaac received the hopes of escape which this speech intimated, he began gradually, and inch by inch, as it were, to raise himself up from the ground, until he fairly rested upon his knees, throwing back his long grey hair and beard, and fixing his keen black eyes upon the palmer's face, with a look expressive at once of hope and fear, not unmingled with suspicion. But when he heard the concluding part of the sentence, his original terror appeared to revive in full force, and he dropped once more on his face, exclaiming, "I possess the means of securing goodwill! Alas! there is but one road to the favour of a Christian, and how can the poor Jew find it, whom extortions have already reduced to the misery of Lazarus?" Then, as if suspicion had overpowered his other feelings, he suddenly exclaimed, "For the love of God, young man, betray me not! For the sake of the great Father who made us all, Jew as well as Gentile, Israelite and Ishmaelite, do me no treason. I have not means to secure the goodwill of a Christian beggar, were he rating it at a single penny." As he spoke these last words, he raised himself, and grasped the palmer's mantle with a look of the most earnest entreaty. The pilgrim extricated himself as if it were contamination in the touch. "Wert thou loaded with all the wealth of thy tribe," he said, "what interest have I to injure thee? In this dress I am vowed to poverty, nor do I change it for aught save a horse and a coat of mail. Yet think not that I care for thy company, or propose myself advantaged by it. Remain here if thou wilt. Cedric the Saxon may protect thee." "Alas," said the Jew, "he will not let me travel in his train. Saxon or Norman will be equally ashamed of the poor Israelite. And to travel by myself through the domains of Philip de Malvoisin and Reginald Front-de-Bœuf! Good youth, I will go with you. Let us haste. Let us gird up our loins. Let us flee. Here is thy staff. Why wilt thou tarry?" "I tarry not," said the pilgrim, giving way to the urgency of his companion, "but I must secure the means of leaving this place. Follow me." He led the way to the adjoining cell, which, as the reader is apprized, was occupied by Gurth, the swineherd. "Arise, Gurth," said the pilgrim, "arise quickly. Undo the postern gate, and let out the Jew and me." Gurth, whose occupation, though now held so mean, gave him as much consequence in Saxon England as that of Eumaeus in Ithaca, was offended at the familiar and commanding tone assumed by the palmer. "The Jew leaving Rotherwood," said he, raising himself on his elbow, and looking superciliously at him, without quitting his pallet, "and travelling in company with the palmer to boot! I should as soon have dreamt," said Wamba, who entered the apartment at the instant, "of his stealing away with a gammon of bacon." "Nevertheless," said Gurth, again laying down his head on the wooden log which served him for a pillow, "both Jew and Gentile must be content to abide the opening of the great gate. We suffer no visitors to depart by stealth at these unseasonable hours." "Nevertheless," said the pilgrim, in a commanding tone, "you will not, I think, refuse me that favour." So saying, he stooped over the bed of the recumbent swineherd, and whispered something in his ear in Saxon. Gurth started up as if electrified. The pilgrim, raising his finger in an attitude, as if to express caution, added, "Gurth, beware. Thou art wont to be prudent. I say, undo the postern. Thou shalt know more anon." With hasty alacrity Gurth obeyed him, while Wamba and the Jew followed, both wondering at the sudden change in the swineherd's demeanour. "My mule, my mule!" said the Jew, as soon as they stood without the postern. "Fetch him his mule," said the pilgrim, "and, hearest thou, let me have another, that I may bear him company till he is beyond these parts. I will return it safely to some of Cedric's train at Ashby. And do thou," he whispered the rest in Gurth's ear. "Willingly, most willingly shall it be done," said Gurth, and instantly departed to execute the commission. "I wish I knew," said Wamba, when his comrade's back was turned, "to what you palmers learn in the Holy Land." "To say our orisons, fool," answered the pilgrim, "to repent our sins, and to mortify ourselves with fastings, vigils, and long prayers." "Something more potent than that," answered the jester; "for when would repentance or prayer make Gurth Do a courtesy, or a fasting or vigil persuade him to lend you a mule? I trow, you might as well have told his favourite black boar of thy vigils and penance, and wouldst have gotten as civil an answer." "Go to," said the Pilgrim, "thou art but a Saxon fool." "Thou sayest well," said the Jester. "Had I been born a Norman, as I think thou art, I would have had luck on my side, and been next door to a wise man." At this moment Gurth appeared on the opposite side of the moat with the mules. The travellers crossed the ditch upon a drawbridge of only 2 planks' breadth, the narrowness of which was matched with the straightness of the postern, and with a little wicket in the exterior palisade, which gave access to the forest. No sooner had they reached the mules than the Jew, with hasty and trembling hands, secured behind the saddle a small bag of blue buckram, which he took from under his cloak, containing, as he muttered, "a change of raiment, only a change of raiment." Then, getting upon the animal with more alacrity and haste than could have been anticipated from his years, he lost no time in so disposing of the skirts of his gaberdine, as to conceal completely from observation the burden which he had thus deposited en croupe. The Pilgrim mounted with more deliberation, reaching as he departed his hand to Gurth, who kissed it with the utmost possible veneration. The swineherd stood gazing after the travellers until they were lost under the boughs of the forest path, when he was disturbed from his reverie by the voice of Wamba. "Knowest thou," said the Jester, "my good friend Gurth, that thou art strangely courteous and most unwontedly pious on this summer morning? I would I were a black prior or a barefoot palmer, to avail myself of thy unwonted zeal and courtesy. Certes, I would make more out of it than a kiss of the hand." "Thou art no fool thus far, Wamba," answered Gurth, "though thou arguest from appearances, and the wisest of us can do no more. But it is time to look after my charge." So saying, he turned back to the mansion, attended by the Jester. Meanwhile the travellers continued to press on their journey, with a despatch which argued the extremity of the Jew's fears, since persons at his age are seldom fond of rapid motion. The Palmer, to whom every path and outlet in the wood appeared to be familiar, led the way through the most devious paths, and more than once excited anew the suspicion of the Israelite that he intended to betray him into some ambuscade of his enemies. His doubts might have been indeed pardoned, for except perhaps the flying fish, there was no race existing on the earth, in the air, or the waters, who were the object of such an unintermitting, general, and relentless persecution as the Jews of this period. Upon the slightest and most unreasonable pretences, as well as upon accusations the most absurd and groundless, their persons and property were exposed to every turn of popular fury. The Norman, Saxon, Dane, and Briton, however adverse these races were to each other, contended which should look with the greatest detestation upon a people whom it was accounted a point of religion to hate, to revile, to despise, to plunder, and to persecute. The kings of the Norman race, and the independent nobles who followed their example in all acts of tyranny, maintained against this devoted people a persecution of a more regular, calculated, and self-interested kind. It is a well-known story of King John that he confined a wealthy Jew in one of the royal castles, and daily caused one of his teeth to be torn out, until, when the jaw of the unhappy Israelite was half disfurnished, he consented to pay a large sum, which it was the tyrant's object to extort from him. The little ready money which was in the country was chiefly in possession of this persecuted people, and the nobility hesitated not to follow the example of their sovereign in wringing it from them by every species of oppression, and even personal torture. Yet the passive courage inspired by the love of gain induced the Jews to dare the various evils to which they were subjected, in consideration of the immense profits which they were enabled to realize in a country naturally so wealthy as England. In spite of every kind of discouragement, and even of the special court of taxations already mentioned, called the Jews' Exchequer, erected for the very purpose of despoiling and distressing them, the Jews increased, multiplied, and accumulated huge sums, which they transferred from one hand to another by means of bills of exchange, an invention for which commerce is said to be indebted to them, and which enabled them to transfer their wealth from land to land, that, when threatened with oppression in one country, their treasure might be secured in another. The obstinacy and avarice of the Jews being thus, in a measure, placed in opposition to the fanaticism and tyranny of those under whom they lived, seemed to increase in proportion to the persecution with which they were visited. And the immense wealth they usually acquired in commerce, while it frequently placed them in danger, was at other times used to extend their influence, and to secure them a certain degree of protection. On these terms they lived, and their character, influenced accordingly, was watchful, suspicious, and timid, yet obstinate, uncomplying, and skilful in evading the dangers to which they were exposed. When the travellers had pushed on at a rapid rate through many devious paths, the Palmer at length broke silence. "That large decayed oak," he said, "mark the boundaries over which Front-de-Bœuf claims authority. We are long since far from those of Malvoisin. There is now no fear of pursuit." "May the wheels of their chariots be taken off," said the Jew, "like those of the host of Pharaoh, that they may drive heavily. But leave me not, good pilgrim. Think but of that fierce and savage Templar with his Saracen slaves. They will regard neither territory nor manor, nor lordship." "Our road," said the Palmer, "should here separate, for it beseems not men of my character and thine to travel together longer than needs must be. Besides, what succour couldst thou have from me, a peaceful pilgrim, against 2 armed heathens?" "O good youth," answered the Jew, "thou canst defend me, and I know thou wouldst. Poor as I am, I will requite it, not with money, for money, so help me my father Abraham, I have none, but—" "Money and recompense," said the Palmer, interrupting him, "I have already said I require not of thee. Guide thee I can, and it may be, even in some sort, defend thee, since to protect a Jew against a Saracen can scarce be accounted unworthy of a Christian. Therefore, I, Jew, will see thee safe under some fitting escort. We are now not far from the town of Sheffield, where thou mayest easily find many of thy tribe with whom to take refuge." "The blessing of Jacob be upon thee, good youth," said the Jew. "In Sheffield I can harbour with my kinsman Zareth, and find some means of travelling forth with safety." "Be it so," said the Palmer. "At Sheffield then we part, and half an hour's riding will bring us in sight of that town." The half hour was spent in perfect silence on both parts, the pilgrim perhaps disdaining to address the Jew, except in case of absolute necessity, and the Jew not presuming to force a conversation with a person whose journey to the Holy Sepulchre gave a sort of sanctity to his character. They paused on the top of a gently rising bank, and the pilgrim, pointing to the town of Sheffield, which lay beneath them, repeated the words. "Here, then, we part." "Not till you have had the poor Jew's thanks," said Isaac, "for I presume not to ask you to go with me to my kinsman Zareth's, who might aid me with some means of repaying your good offices." "I have already said," answered the pilgrim, "that I desire no recompense, if among the huge list of thy debtors thou wilt, for my sake, spare the gyves and the dungeon to some unhappy Christian who stands in thy danger. I shall hold this morning service to thee well bestowed." "Stay, stay," said the Jew, laying hold of his garment. "Something would I do more than this, something for thyself. God knows the Jew is poor, yes, Isaac is the beggar of his tribe. But forgive me should I guess what thou most lackest at this moment." "If thou wert to guess truly," said the Palmer, "it is what thou canst not supply, wert thou as wealthy as thou sayest thou art poor." "As I say," echoed the Jew, "oh, believe it, I say but the truth. I am a plundered, indebted, distressed man. Hard hands have wrung from me my goods, my money, my ships, and all that I possessed. Yet I can tell thee what thou lackest, and, it may be, supply it too. Thy wish even now is for a horse and armour." The Palmer started, and turned suddenly towards the Jew. "What fiend prompted that guess?" said he hastily. "No matter," said the Jew, smiling, "so that it be a true one, and as I can guess thy want, so I can supply it." "But consider," said the Palmer, "my character, my dress, my vow." "I know you Christians," replied the Jew, "and that the noblest of you will take the staff and sandal in superstitious penance, and walk afoot to visit the graves of dead men." "Blaspheme not, Jew," said the Pilgrim sternly. "Forgive me," said the Jew, "I spoke rashly, but there dropped words from me last night and this morning that, like sparks from flint, showed the metal within, and in the bosom of that Palmer's gown is hidden a knight's chain and spurs of gold. They glanced as you stooped over my bed in the morning." The Pilgrim could not forbear smiling. "Were thy garments searched by as curious an eye, Isaac," said he, "what discoveries might not be made?" "No more of that," said the Jew, changing colour, and drawing forth his writing materials in haste, as if to stop the conversation, he began to write upon a piece of paper, which he supported on the top of his yellow cap, without dismounting from his mule. When he had finished, he delivered the scroll, which was in the Hebrew character, to the Pilgrim, saying, "In the town of Leicester all men know the rich Jew, Kirjath Jairam of Lombardy. Give him this scroll. He hath on sale 6 Milan harnesses, the worst would suit a crowned head, 10 goodly steeds, the worst might mount a king, were he to do battle for his throne. Of these he will give thee thy choice, with everything else that can furnish thee forth for the tournament. When it is over, thou wilt return them safely, unless thou shouldst have wherewith to pay their value to the owner." "But, Isaac," said the Pilgrim, smiling, "dost thou know that in these sports the arms and steed of the knight who is unhorsed are forfeit to his victor? Now I may be unfortunate, and so lose what I cannot replace or repay." The Jew looked somewhat astounded at this possibility, but, collecting his courage, he replied hastily, "No, no, no, it is impossible, I will not think so. The blessing of our Father will be upon thee, thy lance will be powerful as the rod of Moses." So saying, he was turning his mule's head away, when the Palmer, in his turn, took hold of his gaberdine. "Nay, but Isaac, thou knowest not all the risk. The steed may be slain, the armour injured, for I will spare neither horse nor man. Besides, those of thy tribe give nothing for nothing. Something there must be paid for their use." The Jew twisted himself in the saddle, like a man in a fit of the colic, but his better feelings predominated over those which were most familiar to him. "I care not," he said, "I care not. Let me go. If there is damage, it will cost you nothing. If there is usage money, Kirjath Jairam will forgive it for the sake of his kinsman Isaac. Fare thee well. Yet hark thee, good youth," said he, turning about, "thrust thyself not too forward into this vain hurly-burly. I speak not for endangering the steed and coat of armour, but for the sake of thine own life and limbs." "Gramercy for thy caution," said the Palmer, again smiling. "I will use thy courtesy frankly, and it will go hard with me, but I will requite it." They parted, and took different roads for the town of Sheffield. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Knights, with a long retinue of their squires, in gaudy liveries, march, and quaint attires. One laced the helm, another held the lance, a third the shining buckler did advance. The courser pawed the ground with restless feet, and snorting foamed and champed the golden bit. The smiths and armourers on palfreys ride, files in their hands, and hammers at their side, and nails for loosened spears, and thongs for shields provide. The yeomen guard the streets in seemly bands, and clowns come crowding on, with cudgels in their hands. Palamon and Arcite. The condition of the English nation was at this time sufficiently miserable. King Richard was absent a prisoner, and in the power of the perfidious and cruel Duke of Austria. Even the very place of his captivity was uncertain, and his fate but very imperfectly known to the generality of his subjects, who were in the meantime a prey to every species of subaltern oppression. Prince John, in league with Philip of France, Coeur de Lion's mortal enemy, was using every species of influence with the Duke of Austria to prolong the captivity of his brother Richard, to whom he stood indebted for so many favours. In the meantime, he was strengthening his own faction in the kingdom, of which he proposed to dispute the succession in case of the king's death, with the legitimate heir, Arthur, Duke of Brittany, son of Geoffrey Plantagenet, the elder brother of John. This usurpation, it is well known, he afterwards effected. His own character being light, profligate, and perfidious, John easily attached to his person and faction not only all who had reason to dread the resentment of Richard for criminal proceedings during his absence, but also the numerous class of lawless resolutes, whom the Crusades had turned back on their country, accomplished in the vices of the East, impoverished in substance, and hardened in character, and who placed their hopes of harvest in civil commotion. To these causes of public distress and apprehension must be added the multitude of outlaws who, driven to despair by the oppression of the feudal nobility, and the severe exercise of the forest laws, banded together in large gangs, and keeping possession of the forests and the wastes, set at defiance the justice and magistracy of the country. The nobles themselves, each fortified within his own castle, and playing the petty sovereign over his own dominions, were the leaders of bands scarce less lawless and oppressive than those of the avowed depredators. To maintain these retainers, and to support the extravagance and magnificence which their pride induced them to affect, the nobility borrowed sums of money from the Jews at the most usurious interest, which gnawed into their estates like consuming cankers, scarce to be cured unless when circumstances gave them an opportunity of getting free, by exercising upon their creditors some act of unprincipled violence. Under the various burdens imposed by this unhappy state of affairs, the people of England suffered deeply for the present, and had yet more dreadful cause to fear for the future. To augment their misery, a contagious disorder of a dangerous nature spread through the land, and, rendered more virulent by the uncleanness, the indifferent food, and the wretched lodging of the lower classes, swept off many whose fate the survivors were tempted to envy, as exempting them from the evils which were to come. Yet amid these accumulated distresses, the poor as well as the rich, the vulgar as well as the noble, in the event of a tournament which was the grand spectacle of that age, felt as much interest as the half-starved citizen of Madrid, who has not a real left to buy provisions for his family, feels in the issue of a full beast. Neither duty nor infirmity could keep youth or age from such exhibitions. The passage of arms, as it was called, which was to take place at Ashby, in the county of Leicester, as champions of the first renown were to take the field in the presence of Prince John himself, who was expected to grace the lists, had attracted universal attention, and an immense confluence of persons of all ranks hastened upon the appointed morning to the place of combat. The scene was singularly romantic. On the verge of a wood, which approached to within a mile of the town of Ashby, was an extensive meadow of the finest and most beautiful green turf, surrounded on one side by the forest, and fringed on the other by straggling oak trees, some of which had grown to an immense size. The ground, as if fashioned on purpose for the martial display which was intended, sloped gradually down on all sides to a level bottom, which was enclosed for the lists with strong palisades, forming a space of 1/4 of a mile in length, and about half as broad. The form of the enclosure was an oblong square, save that the corners were considerably rounded off, in order to afford more convenience for the spectators. The openings for the entry of the combatants were at the northern and southern extremities of the lists, accessible by strong wooden gates, each wide enough to admit 2 horsemen riding abreast. At each of these portals were stationed 2 heralds, attended by 6 trumpets, as many pursuivants, and a strong body of men-at-arms, for maintaining order, and ascertaining the quality of the knights who proposed to engage in this martial game. On a platform beyond the southern entrance, formed by a natural elevation of the ground, were pitched 5 magnificent pavilions, adorned with pennons of russet and black, the chosen colours of the 5 knights challengers. The cords of the tents were of the same colour. Before each pavilion was suspended the shield of the knight by whom it was occupied, and beside it stood his squire, quaintly disguised as a salvage or sylvan man, or in some other fantastic dress, according to the taste of his master, the character he was pleased to assume during the game. Begin note. This sort of masquerade is supposed to have occasioned the introduction of supporters into the science of heraldry. End note. The central pavilion, as the place of honour, had been assigned to Brian de Bois-Guilbert, whose renown in all games of chivalry, no less than his connections with the knights who had undertaken this passage of arms, had occasioned him to be eagerly received into the company of the challengers, and even adopted as their chief and leader, though he had so recently joined them. On one side of his tent were pitched those of Reginald Front-Bœuf and Richard de Malvoisin, and on the other was a pavilion of Hugh de Grantmesnil, a noble baron in the vicinity, whose ancestor had been Lord High Steward of England in the time of the Conqueror, and his son William Rufus. Ralph de Vipon, a knight of St. John of Jerusalem, who had some ancient possessions at a place called Heather, near Ashby de la Zouche, occupied the 5th pavilion. From the entrance into the lists, a gently sloping passage 10 yards in breadth led up to the platform on which the tents were pitched. It was strongly secured by a palisade on each side, as was the esplanade in front of the pavilions, and the whole was guarded by men-at-arms. The northern access to the lists terminated in a similar entrance of 30 feet in breadth, at the extremity of which was a large enclosed space for such knights as might be disposed to enter the lists with the challengers, behind which were placed tents containing refreshments of every kind for their accommodation, with armourers, tarriers, and other attendants, in readiness to give their services wherever they might be necessary. The exterior of the lists was in part occupied by temporary galleries, spread with tapestry and carpets, and accommodated with cushions for the convenience of those ladies and nobles who were expected to attend the tournament. A narrow space betwixt these galleries and the lists gave accommodation for yeomanry and spectators of a better degree than the mere vulgar, and might be compared to the pit of a theatre. The promiscuous multitude arranged themselves upon large banks of turf, prepared for the purpose, which, aided by the natural elevation of the ground, enabled them to overlook the galleries, and obtain a fair view into the lists. Besides the accommodation which these stations afforded, many hundreds had perched themselves on the branches of the trees which surrounded the meadow, and even the steeple of a country church at some distance was crowded with spectators. It only remains to notice respecting the general arrangement, that one gallery in the very centre of the eastern side of the lists, and consequently exactly opposite to the spot where the shock of the combat was to take place, was raised higher than the others, more richly decorated, and graced by a sort of throne and canopy on which the royal arms were emblazoned. Squires, pages, and yeomen in rich liveries waited around this place of honour, which was designed for Prince John and his attendants. Opposite to this royal gallery was another elevated to the same height on the western side of the lists, and more gaily, if less sumptuously decorated, than that destined for the prince himself. A train of pages and of young maidens, the most beautiful who could be selected, gaily dressed in fancy habits of green and pink, surrounded a throne decorated in the same colours. Among pennons and flags bearing wounded hearts, burning hearts, bleeding hearts, bows and quivers, and all the commonplace emblems of the triumphs of Cupid, a blazoned inscription informed the spectators that this seat of honour was designed for la reine de la spéauté de les amours. But who was to represent the Queen of Beauty and of Love on the present occasion, no one was prepared to guess. Meanwhile, spectators of every description thronged forward to occupy their respective stations, and not without many quarrels concerning those which they were entitled to hold. Some of these were settled by the men-at-arms with brief ceremony, the shafts of their battle-axes and pummels of their swords being readily employed as arguments to convince the more refractory. Others, which involved the rival claims of more elevated persons, were determined by the heralds or by the two marshals of the field, William de Weevil and Stephen de Martival, who, armed at all points, rode up and down the lists to enforce and preserve good order among the spectators. Gradually the galleries became filled with knights and nobles in their robes of peace, whose long and rich-tinted mantles were contrasted with the gayer and more splendid habits of the ladies, who, in a greater proportion than even the men themselves, thronged to witness a sport which one would have thought too bloody and dangerous to afford their sex much pleasure. The lower and interior space was soon filled by substantial yeomen and burghers, and such of the lesser gentry as, from modesty, poverty, or dubious title, durst not assume any higher place. It was, of course, amongst these that the most frequent disputes for precedence occurred. "Dog of an unbeliever," said an old man, whose threadbare tunic bore witness to his poverty, as his sword and dagger and golden chain intimated his pretensions to rank. "Whelp of a she-wolf, darest thou press upon a Christian and a Norman gentleman of the blood of Montdidier?" This rough expostulation was addressed to no other than our acquaintance Isaac, who, richly and even magnificently dressed, in a gaberdine ornamented with lace and lined with fur, was endeavouring to make place in the foremost row beneath the gallery for his daughter, the beautiful Rebecca, who had joined him at Ashby, and who was now hanging on her father's arm, not a little terrified by the popular displeasure which seemed generally excited by her parents' presumption. But Isaac, though we have seen him sufficiently timid on other occasions, knew well that at present he had nothing to fear. It was not in places of general resort, or where their equals were assembled, that any avaricious or malevolent noble durst offer him injury. At such meetings the Jews were under the protection of the general law, and if that proved a weak assurance, it usually happened that there were among the persons assembled some barons who, for their own interested motives, were ready to act as their protectors. On the present occasion, Isaac felt more than usually confident, being aware that Prince John was even then in the very act of negotiating a large loan from the Jews of York, to be secured upon certain jewels and lands. Isaac's own share in this transaction was considerable, and he well knew that the prince's eager desire to bring it to a conclusion would ensure him his protection in the dilemma in which he stood. Emboldened by these considerations, the Jew pursued his point, and jostled the Norman Christian without respect either to his descent, quality, or religion. The complaints of the old man, however, excited the indignation of the bystanders. One of these, a stout, well-set yeoman, arrayed in Lincoln green, having 12 arrows stuck in his belt with a baldric and a badge of silver, and a bow of 6 feet length in his hand, turned short round, and while his countenance, which his constant exposure to weather had rendered brown as a hazel-nut, grew darker with anger, he advised the Jew to remember that all the wealth he had acquired by sucking the blood of his miserable victims had but swelled him like a bloated spider, which might be overlooked while he kept in a comer, but would be crushed if it ventured into the light. This intimation, delivered in Norman English, with a firm voice and a stern aspect, made the Jew shrink back, and he would have probably withdrawn himself altogether from a vicinity so dangerous, had not the attention of every one been called to the sudden entrance of Prince John, who at that moment entered the lists, attended by a numerous and gay train, consisting partly of laymen, partly of churchmen, as light in their dress and as gay in their demeanour as their companions. Among the latter was the Prior of Jorvaulx in the most gallant trim which a dignitary of the church could venture to exhibit. Fur and gold were not spared in his garments, and the points of his boots, out-heralding the preposterous fashion of the time, turned up so very far as to be attached not to his knees merely, but to his very girdle, and effectually prevented him from putting his foot into the stirrup. This, however, was a slight inconvenience to the gallant abbot, who, perhaps even rejoicing in the opportunity to display his accomplished horsemanship before so many spectators, especially of the fair sex, dispensed with the use of these supports to a timid rider. The rest of Prince John's retinue consisted of the favourite leaders of his mercenary troops, some marauding barons and profligate attendants upon the court, with several Knights Templars and Knights of St. John. It may be here remarked that the knights of these two orders were accounted hostile to King Richard, having adopted the side of Philip of France in the long train of disputes which took place in Palestine betwixt that monarch and the lion-hearted King of England. It was the well-known consequence of this discord that Richard's repeated victories had been rendered fruitless, his romantic attempts to besiege Jerusalem disappointed, and the fruit of all the glory which he had acquired had dwindled into an uncertain truce with the Sultan Saladin. With the same policy which had dictated the conduct of their brethren in the Holy Land, the Templars and Hospitallers in England and Normandy attached themselves to the faction of Prince John, having little reason to desire the return of Richard to England, or the succession of Arthur, his legitimate heir. For the opposite reason, Prince John hated and contemned the few Saxon families of consequence which subsisted in England, and omitted no opportunity of mortifying and affronting them, being conscious that his person and pretensions were disliked by them, as well as by the greater part of the English commons, who feared farther innovation upon their rights and liberties from a sovereign of John's licentious and tyrannical disposition. Attended by this gallant equipage, himself well mounted and splendidly dressed in crimson and in gold, bearing upon his hand a falcon, and having his head covered by a rich fur bonnet, adorned with a circle of precious stones, from which his long curled hair escaped and overspread his shoulders, Prince John, upon a grey and high-mettled palfrey, caracoled within the lists at the head of his jovial party, laughing loud with his train, and eyeing with all the boldness of royal criticism the beauties who adorned the lofty galleries. Those who remarked in the physiognomy of the prince a dissolute audacity, mingled with extreme haughtiness and indifference to the feelings of others who could not yet deny to his countenance that sort of comeliness which belongs to an open set of features, well formed by nature, modelled by art to the usual rules of courtesy, yet so frank and honest, that they seemed as if they disclaimed to conceal the natural workings of the soul. Such an expression is often mistaken for manly frankness, when in truth it arises from the reckless indifference of a libertine disposition, conscious of superiority of birth, of wealth, or of some other adventitious advantage, totally unconnected with personal merit. To those who did not think so deeply, and they were the greater number by 100 to 1, the splendour of Prince John's renault, i.e. fur trippet, the richness of his cloak, lined with the most costly sables, his Maroquin boots and golden spurs, together with the grace with which he managed his palfrey, were sufficient to merit clamorous applause. In his joyous caracole round the lists, the attention of the prince was called by the commotion, not yet subsided, which had attended the ambitious movement of Isaac towards the higher places of the assembly. The quick eye of Prince John instantly recognized the Jew, but was much more agreeably attracted by the beautiful daughter of Zion, who, terrified by the tumult, clung close to the arm of her aged father. The figure of Rebecca might indeed have compared with the proudest beauties of England, even though it had been judged by as shrewd a connoisseur as Prince John. Her form was exquisitely symmetrical, and was shown to advantage by a sort of Eastern dress, which she wore according to the fashion of the females of her nation. Her turban of yellow silk suited well with the darkness of her complexion. The brilliancy of her eyes, the superb arch of her eyebrows, her well-formed aquiline nose, her teeth as white as pearl, and the profusion of her sable tresses, which, each arranged in its own little spiral of twisted curls, fell down upon as much of a lovely neck and bosom as a simar of the richest Persian silk, exhibiting flowers in their natural colours embossed upon a purple ground, permitted to be visible, all these constituted a combination of loveliness, which yielded not to the most beautiful of the maidens who surrounded her. It is true that of the golden and pearl-studded clasps, which closed her vest from the throat to the waist, the three uppermost were left unfastened on account of the heat, which something enlarged the prospect to which we allude. A diamond necklace, with pendants of inestimable value, were by this means also made more conspicuous. The feather of an ostrich, fastened in her turban by an agraffe set with brilliants, was another distinction of the beautiful Jewess, scoffed and sneered at by the proud dames who sat above her, but secretly envied by those who affected to deride them. "By the bald scalp of Abraham," said Prince John, "yonder Jewess must be the very model of that perfection whose charms drove frantic the wisest king that ever lived." "What sayest thou, Prior Aymer? By the temple of that wise king which our wiser brother Richard proved unable to recover, she is the very bride of the canticles." "The rose of Sharon and the lily of the valley," answered the prior in a sort of snuffling tone, "but your grace must remember she is still but a Jewess." "Ay," added Prince John without heeding him, "and there is my mammon of unrighteousness too, the Marquis of Marks, the Baron of Byzance, contesting for her place with penniless dogs, whose threadbare cloaks have not a single cross in their pouches to keep the devil from dancing there. By the body of Saint Mark, my prince of supplies, with his lovely Jewess, shall have a place in that gallery. What is she, Isaac, thy wife or thy daughter, that eastern houri that thou lockest under thy arm as thou wouldst thy treasure casket?" "My daughter, Rebecca, so please your grace," answered Isaac with a low congee, nothing embarrassed by the prince's salutation, in which, however, there was at least as much mockery as courtesy. "The wiser man thou," said John, with a peal of laughter, in which his gay followers obsequiously joined. "But, daughter or wife, she should be preferred according to her beauty and thy merits. Who sits above there?" he continued, bending his eye on the gallery. "Saxon churls, lolling at their lazy length. Out upon them! Let them sit close, and make room for my prince of usurers and his lovely daughter. I'll make the hinds know they must share the high places of the synagogue with those whom the synagogue properly belongs to." Those who occupied the gallery to whom this injurious and unpolite speech was addressed were the family of Cedric the Saxon, with that of his ally and kinsman, Athelstane of Königsberg, a personage who, on account of his descent from the last Saxon monarchs of England, was held in the highest respect by all the Saxon natives of the north of England. But with the blood of this ancient royal race, many of their infirmities had descended to Athelstane. He was comely in countenance, bulky and strong in person, and in the flower of his age, yet inanimate in expression, dull-eyed, heavy-browed, inactive, and sluggish in all his motions, and so slow in resolution, that the sobriquet of one of his ancestors was conferred upon him, and he was very generally called Athelstane the Unready. His friends, and he had many, who, as well as Cedric, were passionately attached to him, contended that this sluggish temper arose not from want of courage, but from mere want of decision. Others alleged that his hereditary vice of drunkenness had obscured his faculties, never of a very acute order, and that the passive courage and meek good nature which remained behind were merely the dregs of a character that might have been deserving of praise, but of which all the valuable parts had flown off in the progress of a long course of brutal debauchery. It was to this person, such as we have described him, that the prince addressed his imperious command to make place for Isaac and Rebecca. Athelstane, utterly confounded at an order which the manners and the feelings of the times rendered so injuriously insulting, unwilling to obey, yet undetermined how to resist, opposed only the vis incertiae to the will of John, and, without stirring or making any motion whatever of obedience, opened his large grey eyes, and stared at the prince with an astonishment which had in it something extremely ludicrous. But the impatient John regarded it in no such light. "The Saxon porker," he said, "is either asleep or minds me not. Prick him with your lance, De Bracy," speaking to a knight who rode near him, the leader of a band of free companions or condottieri, that is, of mercenaries belonging to no particular nation, but attached for a time to any prince by whom they were paid. There was a murmur even among the attendants of Prince John, but De Bracy, whose profession freed him from all scruples, extended his long lance over the space which separated the gallery from the lists, and would have executed the commands of the prince before Athelstane the Unready had recovered presence of mind sufficient even to draw back his person from the weapon, had not Cedric, as prompt as his companion was tardy, unsheathed with the speed of lightning the short sword which he wore, and at a single blow severed the point of the lance from the handle. The blood rushed into the countenance of Prince John. He swore one of his deepest oaths, and was about to utter some threat corresponding in violence, when he was diverted from his purpose, partly by his own attendants, who gathered around him, conjuring him to be patient, partly by a general exclamation of the crowd, uttered in loud applause of the spirited conduct of Cedric. The prince rolled his eyes in indignation, as if to collect some safe and easy victim, and chancing to encounter the firm glance of the same archer whom we have already noticed, and who seemed to persist in his gesture of applause, in spite of the frowning aspect which the prince bent upon him, he demanded his reason for clamouring thus. "I always add my holloa," said the yeoman, "when I see a good shot or a gallant blow." "Sayest thou?" answered the prince. "Then thou canst hit the white thyself, I'll warrant." "A woodsman's mark, at a woodsman's distance I can hit," answered the yeoman. "And what Tyrrel's mark, at 100 yards?" said a voice from behind, but by whom uttered could not be discerned. This allusion to the fate of William Rufus, his relative, at once incensed and alarmed Prince John. He satisfied himself, however, with commanding the men-at-arms, who surrounded the lists, to keep an eye on the braggart, pointing to the yeoman. "By Saint Grizzle," he added, "we will try his own skill, who is so ready to give his voice to the feats of others." "I shall not fly the trial," said the yeoman, with the composure which marked his whole deportment. "Meanwhile, stand up, ye Saxon churls," said the fiery prince, "for by the light of heaven, since I have said it, the Jew shall have his seat amongst ye." "By no means, an it please your grace. It is not fit for such as we to sit with the rulers of the land," said the Jew, whose ambition for precedence, though it had led him to dispute place with the extenuated and impoverished descendant of the line of Montdidier, by no means stimulated him to an intrusion upon the privileges of the wealthy Saxons. "Up, infidel dog, when I command you," said Prince John, "or I will have thy swarthy hide stripped off, and tanned for horse furniture." Thus urged, the Jew began to ascend the steep and narrow steps which led up to the gallery. "Let me see," said the prince, "who dare stop him?" fixing his eye on Cedric, whose attitude intimated his intention to hurl the Jew down headlong. The catastrophe was prevented by the clown Wamba, who, springing betwixt his master and Isaac, and exclaiming in answer to the prince's defiance, "Marry, that will I," opposed to the beard of the Jew a shield of brawn, which he plucked from beneath his cloak, and with which, doubtless, he had furnished himself, lest the tournament should have proved longer than his appetite could endure abstinence. Finding the abomination of his tribe opposed to his very nose, while the jester at the same time flourished his wooden sword above his head, the Jew recoiled, missed his footing, and rolled down the steps. An excellent jest to the spectators, who set up a loud laughter, in which Prince John and his attendants heartily joined. "Deal me the prize, cousin Prince," said Wamba. "I have vanquished my foe in fair fight with sword and shield," he added, brandishing the brawn in one hand and the wooden sword in the other. "Who and what art thou, noble champion?" said Prince John, still laughing. "A fool by right of descent," answered the jester. "I am Wamba, the son of Witless, who was the son of Weatherbrain, who was the son of Alderman. Make room for the Jew in front of the lower ring," said Prince John, not unwilling perhaps to seize an apology to desist from his original purpose. To place the vanquished beside the victor were false heraldry. "Knave upon fool were worse," answered the jester, "and Jew upon bacon worst of all." "Gramercy, good fellow," cried Prince John, "thou pleasest me. Here, Isaac, lend me a handful of byzants." As the Jew, stunned by the request, afraid to refuse, and unwilling to comply, fumbled in the furred bag which hung by his girdle, and was perhaps endeavouring to ascertain how few coins might pass for a handful, the Prince stooped from his jennet, and settled Isaac's doubts by snatching the pouch itself from his side, and flinging to Wamba a couple of the gold pieces which it contained. He pursued his career round the lists, leaving the Jew to the derision of those around him, and himself receiving as much applause from the spectators as if he had done some honest and honourable action. End of Chapter 7.